Not every adventure should be a dungeon. I am surfing around today looking at various things, and I run across an article by the Angry DM saying every adventure is a dungeon. And I look at this and I go, what? And he bases that on what the actual expletive deleted is an adventure anyway. And my short answer to that is there's an old phrase, you can pound those screws in real good with that pipe wrench. And he, I read through this and I go, so what is, first off, this is the Angry DM's definition. An adventure is the smallest segment of a role-playing game that can be considered a complete and satisfying story. Well, first, what does he mean? Okay, satisfying is not an objective criteria. All right. And complete, he doesn't define that either. So what is it? He basically comes up with three criteria. How is the adventure resolved, and what do the characters, why do the characters want the resolution, and why do the players want to play the adventure? And I go, I have some real problems with this. Because the way I game, things often aren't resolved. If you look at the interesting one that was just, if you've watched True Detective, which is a series on HBO, if you watch the first season, there really isn't a resolution at the end. In fact, it adds more questions than it answers. There is no resolution. And the second season changes completely, and so, different things. So don't get a resolution. Don't know if they'll actually go back and do that. If you've read the Game of Thrones, is not a resolution at the end of any of those books. And the problem that I have with the description that the Angry DM goes on is he goes, and he basically is talking about directed graphs, and he draws this diagram and says this, but he doesn't do it in a rigorous way. And so, being the kind of person I am, and I've actually mentioned this in my connectivity, so I pull out my Discrete Structures book, and the definition of, it says, this is definition in the book on page 58. It says a multigraph, a multiple graph or multigraph G consists of a set of vertices. Okay, let me read that again, because it should be precise. A multiple graph or multigraph G consists of a set V of vertices, a set A of arcs, and a function phi from the set A to the set V cross V. So that's what a multigraph is, and that's graph theory. That's probably more math than any of you really want to hear. But I always found it fascinating. But what he was arguing is that, a dungeon is a dungeon because it's a multigraph. And I go, no. If I read through the example, they use a multigraph to describe the tournaments of a round robin team tournament. So a round robin team tournament is a dungeon. By his argument, it doesn't fit. But it's got to be role playing, and I'm going, okay, I have a team of kobolds versus a team of orcs. The problem with it is that a dungeon is one kind of adventure, and sure, you can say, oh, this adventure actually is a dungeon because I pound it in with the pipe wrench just like I pound those screws in real well. But a town adventure is really not a dungeon. Yes, it can be represented as a multigraph, but then lots of things can be represented as a multigraph. Just because you can represent it as a multigraph does not make it a dungeon. In essence, arguably most things can be represented as a multigraph. You've got a graphical representation of how things work, and you can, from discrete structures, you can calculate the connectivity or reachability of anything in that, and that's why what really attracted me to this. But it doesn't make it a dungeon. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not an interesting way of representing a dungeon adventure or a city adventure, but it's a multigraph. It's not being a multigraph does not make something a dungeon. So he says that an adventure has three criteria. How is the adventure resolved? Why do the characters want the resolution? And why do the players want to play the adventure? Well, in my kind of adventures, some of the things are not resolved. In essence, let's take a concrete example. It says it's a small segment of a role-playing game that can be considered complete and a satisfying story. So the party is attacked by some monsters and they kill them. So that's an adventure. But let's see, how is the adventure resolved? By the death of the monsters. Why do the characters want the resolution? To survive. Why do the players want to play the adventure? Well, they may not have had a choice. They're walking along a trail and the monsters attack them. So is that a small segment of a role-playing game that can be considered complete and satisfying story? Now, is it satisfying? We survived. We killed the creatures. But I don't think. I don't even view that. I view that as an encounter, not an adventure. I normally refer to an adventure as a session, and that gets a little bit funny because I do most of my gaming online. So what isn't it? In fact, I read this and I started wondering, should I call this a session? Should I call this an adventure? What do we call this? And I admit that things get very fuzzy when we start talking about this definition. But every adventure isn't a dungeon. Adventure can be a town adventure. And at least to me, and I have a hard time when it says complete and satisfying. I think an adventure should be the smallest segment of a role-playing game that was fun. Okay? Because if I enjoyed it, that was a adventure. If the players enjoyed it, that was an adventure. And that means I could have multiple adventures per session or whatever, but it doesn't have to be complete, because one of the things that I like to do is have consequences of players' actions. So you go out and you defeat the monster. Great. You've defeated the monster. But that could have repercussions down the road. So that the monster, as I was reading through some of my stories, I find the one where the party goes and they kill a series of monsters and they find the treasure. And they take the treasure back and actually parts of it they melt down and sell. But what happens is that the monsters that they killed were actually the guardians of something larger and eviler. And that they didn't recognize that, so they killed the monsters were there for a purpose to keep people away from the thing that was worse. And yeah, they got hungry and were terrorizing a village, and the party wanted the treasure, so they got the treasure, but it had repercussions in that now the things that they actually melted down, they knew they were magical weapons, but they were worth more melted down than they were as weapons. And so they melted a bunch of them down. Now those weapons are gone and they've got to defeat this thing that they've unleashed. So that's where the consequences came in. And so the adventure was not resolved. It actually caused a deeper conflict. So I like to do things that go on and on and on. The parties in my world of Tiglath ran into various situations, and they would hear stories about something off in the distance. They would, one of the things that they never would, that was definitely not resolved, it was mentioned throughout several adventures, were that the invading force, the now who were acting as the police, kept finding these these headless dead bodies. And there would be no signs of struggle, just the head was gone. No signs of blood, just the head was gone. And it got stranger because the party then started collecting heads, and I can't remember why they started collecting heads, but they were collecting heads of the monsters, even giant insects, and they had a bag full of heads. But they were sort of being accused of being the people collecting the heads, which just got a little strange. But the real challenge that they kept hearing about this was going on. And it was some of the things that I threw into the adventures so that they would find things that were not resolved. It's much more interesting when the party goes and does something, and then 3 sessions later, I bring up, oh, but that character did this 3 sessions ago. And the party goes, yeah. Well, that has this consequence now, that plays into something else. So I can't see the sessions as being complete because they have consequences. So if you're just playing, every adventure is a dungeon, like I said, you can pound those screws in real well with that pipe wrench. And to me, the mental gymnastics to say that every adventure is a dungeon fails, because all you're arguing is that every adventure can be represented as a multigraph, which is part of discrete structures. It says that I can do that. I can also describe a network diagram. I can describe traffic patterns. I can describe all of these various things as a multigraph, and that doesn't make them dungeons. I mean, traffic patterns in Los Angeles, okay, you could argue maybe that is a dungeon, but it's being committed to do that. I spent years driving around the Washington, D.C. Beltway, which is considered the second worst traffic in the world, the first being in Los Angeles. But that is a torture, but I don't actually consider it a dungeon. And it's not a fun adventure, and it's not resolved because, oh, you made it to work. Why do I do it? To get a paycheck. But why did I want to do that? No, I did it because I had to get a paycheck. So there are reasons that players do this. They get attacked. They do adventures. They find things. Those are what makes role-playing fun. But I really disagree with this concept that every adventure is a dungeon. If you like my video, press the thumbs up button. I'd appreciate that. Or if this interests you, you can always subscribe to my channel. There's a button right above. I look forward to hearing some comments. Tell me what you think about this, and I'll try and reply, and we can see if I'll do some more of these. Thank you.